Let's talk about ISO, what it is and what are the best practices when using and choosing ISO. 5 tips about ISO coming up. Hi there, my name is Peter Forsgard, an Olympus visionary and a professional photographer from Helsinki, Finland. And before we get into the ISO, please consider subscribing to my channel and hit the bell so you get notified when there is a video online. You can also like the video, that's very much appreciated. My channel is all about you getting to be a better photographer and also about Olympus gear. But let's start to talk about ISO. The digital ISO is not exactly the same thing that ISO was during the film era. The ISO is not a same standard that it used to be, which is a pity, but that's the way it is. The ISO of a camera, let's say that you have 2 different cameras and they both have ISO 200, it actually might be in real life, it might be a bit different. The exposure value could be a bit different. So bear that in mind. And DxOMark has very good info about the ISO and what the different ISO values of different cameras actually are. But even though they are not the same thing, the logic is the same. If you change the ISO, then you need to do something about your shutter speed and your aperture. It depends. ISO is still part of the so-called exposure triangle. Understanding the combination of shutter speed, ISO and aperture is crucial to understand what is a correct exposure. And before we get into the tips, let's talk about how to change the ISO in your camera. The easiest way is to press the OK button and change it from the Super Control panel. Or you can also use the dedicated ISO buttons that with the newest Olympus cameras is right here. But you can also assign it to another button if you want, and that works with other Olympus cameras too. So using the button or the Super Control panel is the fastest way. So let's go with the tip number 1. Use as low ISO as possible. Every camera has a base ISO, and with Olympus cameras the base ISO is ISO 200. So that's my recommendation. Always try to use 200 if possible. But if you understand the exposure triangle, you know that sometimes you need to rise up your ISO to a higher values. But with the base ISO, you have the best dynamic range and less noise, or the least amount of noise in your images. So always use the base ISO if possible. And tip number 2, don't be afraid of high ISOs. Well, I just said that use the lowest ISO as possible, but that doesn't mean that you can always use it. So don't be afraid of high ISO numbers. There are 2 things that will be crucial if you use really high ISOs. The first one is to expose your images correctly. That's the main thing, because if you underexpose your image and you need to raise up your exposure, it will introduce some noise, or it will actually reveal the noise. But if you expose to the right, then you need to lower the exposure a bit in post, and that will hide the noise. So that's really an important thing. And there is a video that you can watch about how to make your exposure the best possible way. And then the second thing is, try to get your images as sharp as possible. Yeah, that's true. It is a funny thing. You would not think that sharp images have less noise than unsharp images, but that's the way it is. If you have a properly sharpened image, not sharpened, but focused image, then you will have less noise. The noise is less visible. And there is a video about that, how to get sharp photos. If you haven't seen that, I recommend you watch it. There are some good tips about how to get your images really sharp. And then the third thing is, when using the high ISO, try not to use the extended high ISO. Those will introduce a lot more noise. But there is one exception, and that is astrophotography. There you can use really high ISOs, and let me explain how to do that. First, set the exposure so that the image is correctly exposed at ISO 3200. Then rise up your ISO 2 or 3 stops, and that will mean 12,800 or 25,600 ISO. The image will look really washed out and it will look pretty bad. But when you go to your editing software, lower the exposure by 2 to 3 stops, and voila, the image will be excellent. So in astrophotography that works, but do not use that in any other forms of photography, because any other genres, it won't work. It will ruin your images, because overexposing an image in digital world is not a good idea, except, as I said, the astrophotography. There it works. And then tip number 4, use low ISO. Olympus cameras have extended ISOs also below 200. Some cameras have L64, some have L100, which means of course ISO 64 and ISO 100. Some have only one and some have both. Using those will give you a better image quality, just a tiny bit better image quality. It will have a bit less noise. I have tested it, and there is actually a video about how the low ISO works and what the different ISOs look with different Olympus cameras. But there is only one downside on that. That is, there will be a bit less dynamic range. So if you have a really bright sunlight and really dark shadows, then avoid that, because it will make it even more contrasty image because it has less dynamic range. But of course, if that's something that you want to do to have really high contrast images, then it's not a problem. But otherwise, sometimes low ISO is really good to use. You can have longer shutter speeds, or you can open up the aperture. If, let's say, 200 is too much, then you can lower it down to 64 and have stop and a half, or you can open up stop and a half your aperture to get less depth of field. So sometimes the ISO, the low ISO, I mean, is really wise thing to do. But remember, it will have a bit less dynamic range. And then tip number 5, use auto ISO. And before I get into auto ISO, there will be 2 extra tips after the 5th one, so don't go away. From the menu, you can set the upper and lower limit for your auto ISO. And that's, if let's say that you want to have so that the camera won't go above 6400, then just set that to be your upper limit. And then the lower limit is usually very wise to have 200. But if 6400 is too much for you, then you can use 3200. It's something that you need to decide and what works for you. There are a few good reasons why auto ISO might be a good thing to do or use. The first one is, if you are in a situation where you need to go in and out, let's say there's dark indoors and then you have a bright sunlight outdoors. That could be a wedding, a party, or some kind of other venues that you might be shooting. And then when you go indoors, you need lower ISO, higher ISO, and then when you go outside, you need a lower ISO. Setting up the camera to auto ISO, you don't need to worry about the ISO. It will automatically be correct, which, okay, well, correct is a bit wrong word, but it will be something that is usable, so you don't have the high ISO when you go outside and need to check if something really fast things happen and you need to be quick. Then just auto ISO is very handy. And the second reason is related to this one. If you for some reason need to have a fixed shutter speed and a fixed aperture, but the light changes, then you might want to use auto ISO, and the auto ISO will be your kind of like exposure correction, and that could be a good thing. Let's say that you have photographing a play on a stage, and you want to have the action or freeze the action with certain shutter speeds, and then you need to have certain amount of depth of field with certain aperture, and then you could use auto ISO when the light changes in the scene. You don't have to change your exposure. The exposure will be changed automatically via the auto ISO, so camera will take care of that. But there is one small problem. You cannot correct the exposure by hand if you use that. I haven't figured out. If you know how to do that, then please tell me. But this will lead us to the tip number 1. You can set your camera so that if you have fixed shutter speed and fixed aperture, then set the ISO to the back wheel, and then the back wheel will be your exposure compensation dial, but it will change the ISO, and that could be a very good thing. So it works perfectly and exactly the same way as it works if you have the exposure compensation, which will change the shutter speed. And then the second extra tip. You can set the auto ISO to work so that you can set the lowest shutter speed that it will use. Let's say that you set the lowest shutter speed to 1 second. The auto ISO will remain in ISO 200 or whatever you have set it to be the lowest. Let's say that it is 200. But until the shutter speed needs to be second or longer, it starts to raise up the ISO. So that's a really good way to limit so that the ISO won't get too high if you don't want it to. But when it actually needs to be higher, when there is not enough light, and you want to limit your shutter speed to a certain speed, then it will compensate the exposure with a higher ISO. And I think that's a very good way. Let's say that you have a ability to take images with 4 seconds handheld. So you could limit it to 4 seconds, and if the shutter speed is needed more than 4 seconds, then it won't go longer than that. It will only start to raise the ISO. And I think that's a very good, handy way. And I've sometimes used it, even though I use very seldom auto ISO. But when I do, I always limit my shutter speed to a certain value. And that could also be on the faster side. If you need to freeze an action, like what I said about the photographing a play, for example, and you want to freeze it, let's say that 1/8 hundredths of a second, let's say that that's what you want to freeze the action, then you could set that to be the limit, and after that it will start to raise the ISO. So there are a lot of good ways to use the auto ISO. And I hope this video was helpful, and here are some more for you to watch. There is the playlist of videos about exposure, how to get it right, and then there is the video about how to get your images sharp as possible. But hey, thanks for watching, and bye for now.